The Department of Veterans Affairs estimates 22 veterans commit suicide every day.
22 military veterans.
22 veterans.
22 a day.
22
veterans.
22 veterans.
And specifically the 22 veterans who commit suicide a day. I didn't know this.
When you hear anything about military veterans committing suicide, you would probably think of the number 22. The number 22 comes from a 2012 VA study that reported that 22 veterans commit suicide every day. Well, it's not 22, it's actually 20 a day. In this video, I'll explain the numbers behind suicides and what the military is doing to respond to these numbers. Or maybe I should say, what the military isn't doing. The first step to understanding veteran suicide is to understand the difference between three demographics: military members, veterans, and civilians. Military members are people who are currently in the military. Veterans are people who were previously in the military and are now civilians, and civilians are people who have never been in the military. This is important to understand because each of these demographics have little to do with the other. Military suicides are accounted for through the National Center for Telehealth and Technology, or T2, in which annual reports are published as the Department of Defense Suicide Event Report, or the DoD-SER. Veteran suicides are accounted for through the Department of Veteran Affairs, or the VA, in which annual reports are published directly from the VA. Civilian suicides are accounted for through the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, or the CDC, in which annual reports are published. But I found that the American Association for Suicidology provides the most understandable information on civilian suicides, which ultimately come from the CDC reports. Okay, back to the number 22. This number came from a VA study that was published in 2012 and only represents veteran suicides, not active duty military members. The study collected from only 21 states. Even Texas and California were excluded, which is where the highest population of veterans reside. 4 years later, in 2016, the VA published the largest suicide report ever conducted. Data was collected from all states and concluded that an average of 20 veterans commit suicide every day. Although the number was reduced, it still shows a huge problem. I should mention that suicide is a national problem. Discoveries in science and medicine has certainly helped contribute to lower deaths in many categories, but suicides have been increasing for every demographic across the country. It is literally becoming an epidemic. In order to truly understand the impact of this number, we also have to compare it to military and civilian suicides. This is where rates come into play. Just looking at suicide total numbers doesn't really tell us much because each demographic has a different population size. Remember, active duty military members account for less than 1% of the population. Veterans account for roughly 8% of the population, and when accounting for civilians, we have to only compare to people 17 years of age or older, which comes out to be about 255 million people. So rates represent how many people in a given field for every 100,000 people. The following will be data collected from the year 2014, which is the most up-to-date information for each demographic. The civilian rate is at 13.4, the military rate is a bit higher at 19.9, but the veteran rate increases astronomically to 39. It's important to note that when comparing veteran suicide rates to civilian rates, we have to adjust for gender. The reason for this is because veterans are overwhelmingly male compared to the civilian population. The civilian population is 49% male and 51% female, while the veteran population is 85% male and 15% female. When we adjust both for gender and age, we still have a very significant result. Let's look at the rates for females. The female civilian rate is at 6.0, the female military rate is at 11.7, and the female veteran rate is at 16.7. The female veteran rate is clearly the highest rate of them all. Now for the male rates. The male civilian rate is at 21.1, the male military rate is at 22.0, and the male veteran rate is at 41.6. Are you seeing a pattern? Clearly, veterans of each category have the highest rate. Now, this is a common pattern in nearly all categories for age, gender, and even the total rates. Now, this next graph is probably the most alarming graph provided by the VA report. This VA graph shows that veteran suicide rates are 5.5 times higher than their civilian peers. The straight blue line above represents veterans aged 18 to 29, while the dotted blue line below represents civilians aged 18 to 29. This is a common trend in almost every comparison of veterans to civilians. The most alarming rates are shown in both male and female demographics aged 18 to 29, but note that nearly all veteran suicide rates are higher than their civilian peers. Here, the veteran male aged 18 to 29 rate, shown in the straight blue line, is significantly higher than their civilian peers, shown in the dotted blue line. And here, the veteran female rate, shown in the straight blue line, is significantly higher than their civilian peers, shown in the dotted blue line. These rates have only compared veterans to civilians, so what about the military? The DoD SER report didn't really go into detail to provide rates for age, but just included in the executive summary that, quote, there were no statistically significant difference between the calendar year 2014 military suicide rate and the calendar year 2013 U.S. population suicide rate after adjusting for difference in age and sex, unquote. This is important to understand. If the military and civilian suicide rates have no significant difference, but veterans have a substantially higher suicide rate, what's going on? Well, there's no scientific data to provide such an answer as of yet. But after talking to fellow veterans, we brought up a few perspectives to consider. Being a veteran and transitioning from the military life to a civilian life, that change is dramatic. In the military, a soldier is constantly surrounded by groups of people providing support, socialization, community, and so on. Most importantly, a soldier is constantly being reminded of their duty, a reason for sacrifice, their purpose, and so on. But when a soldier leaves the military and transitions into a civilian life, nearly all of that support and feeling of community disappears, especially the constant reminder of their purpose. And when a veteran enters civilian life, they are certainly not the same person as they were when they first joined, especially if they have been to a combat zone. Combat zones aren't known as fun zones. Really bad things happen, especially if you consider that the Iraq and Afghanistan wars are illegal, immoral, and unjust, tied with the idea that the overwhelming majority of casualties have been innocent civilians. This leads to thoughts of what happens when someone leaves the military and is allowed to think for themselves, to leave that bubble, to leave that groupthink. Does that allow for truth to set in? Does it allow for moral injury to develop? It's also important to understand that veterans with TBI, or a traumatic brain injury, have issues that develop years after their service. Approximately 15 to 20% of all OIF and OEF vets have TBI, which is deeply tied to these high suicide rates. Since the so-called War on Terror began in 2001, the U.S. has been a constant war. As for 2017, the U.S. is actively engaged in military conflicts in 7 countries, and many more with Special Operations Elite units deployed. And since the War on Terror began, suicides have increased to the point that they now outnumber combat deaths. The number 20 most likely won't decrease. So what is the military doing to respond to these numbers? You'll have to watch in the next part of this 2-part series of Veteran Suicides Explained. This has been another Peace Report. Thanks for watching. Hey everybody, thanks for checking out this Peace Report. This topic is particularly close to my heart as I am a veteran of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. But I just want everybody to know that I've officially launched my Patreon page where you can support the Peace Report by donating as little as $1 a month. Yes, that $1 would help the Peace Report make more videos, better videos, and even help empower the voices of resistance against this huge military machine that we're fighting. And and I found that the most important tool for fighting militarism is education. You can also support the Peace Report by subscribing to our YouTube channel, liking our Facebook page, or following us on Twitter. Every little bit helps. I want to give a special thank you to Matthew Ho, who is a veteran of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, just like me. He helped me out a lot on collecting the data for veteran suicides, which took me a long time to really understand the depth of these numbers. I also want to thank Dr. Craig Bryan from the National Center of Veteran Studies. He does really great work on veteran suicides and prevention. And Dr. Bart Andrews as well, who helped provide me some data on civilian suicides. And finally, I want to thank Sloth Squatch for creating some of the animation from this video, which I'll be using more of his animation in the future. You can check him out at the link provided in the description below. Thanks, everybody, and until next time.